When World War II ended, the Soviet Union had not only won, but also expanded. Its army was in the middle of Europe, its control system was total, and those who had directed the war from Moscow held all the power in their hands. Stalin remained firmly in charge, giving no one any room. His closest men were still there, but careful not to overstep. Some thought they could reform something, others just wanted to survive the apparatus they themselves had built. They went from winning on the battlefield to trying to control a devastated country, and half of Europe with orders no one questioned. But that order didn't last the same for everyone. Some ended up executed, others were sidelined, others tried to take control, and there were also those who fell silently. What happened to those Soviet leaders after the end of the war? Where did they end up? The Soviet Union was devastated, but its army commanded half a continent. Stalin shared decisions with no one. From Moscow he gave orders for everything: internal reconstruction, absolute control in the newly occupied countries, and more power for the apparatus he himself managed. Half-broken factories, non-functioning trains, unproductive fields and ruined cities did not slow the pace of orders. The first priority was to focus resources on tanks, weapons, electricity, and heavy industry. Everything else could wait. In the villages, peasants continued to live as before, hungry and without resources, but that was not part of the urgent plans. He remained at the top. Same boss, same system. He changed some names in the decision-making body, brought more people into the group, but everything continued to revolve around him. Anyone who didn't fit in or had a slight doubt was out or ended up arrested. Universities repeated identical speeches, historians wrote only what was permitted, and any deviation was seen as treason. Books, the press, everything spoke of the state, the party, and above all, Stalin. In Eastern Europe, the new governments did not make their own decisions. At first, they seemed like broad coalitions, but they quickly became regimes copied from the Soviet one. Single party, control from Moscow, local repression, and no room for doubt. In his inner circle, there was no designated successor, nor was the topic discussed. Molotov, Beria, Kaganovich, and Malenkov performed assigned tasks, with no open aspirations. Stalin had little trust. He became even more suspicious. He launched campaigns against doctors, fabricated cases against Jews, and planned mass population movements. His image inflated more and more. At 70, the celebration was national, but he hardly ever went out. He gave instructions from his home, received reports, made decisions without consulting. In March of '53, he had a stroke. No one moved quickly. He died on the 5th without leaving anyone prepared to follow. As soon as he was buried, the rest of the circle began to move. The first to act was Beria. He took the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which now also included state security. This gave him control of the police, spies, prisons, and all internal party surveillance. From that position, he freed the detained doctors, annulled the false charges, and declared that everything had been invented. He also ordered the release of thousands from the Gulag. He wanted to end terror as a daily tool. In foreign policy, he spoke of loosening control over Eastern Europe and improving relations with Yugoslavia. He also stated that more autonomy should be given to the non-Russian republics. Within the party, this was a strategic move to gain allies. He knew too much. He had files on everyone. That's why the others saw him as a problem. Khrushchev and Malenkov coordinated to remove him. In June of '53, he was summoned to a meeting and arrested right there. Zhukov led the operation with the support of the army. They took him directly from the building, imprisoned him, and days later announced his detention. He was accused of abuse of authority, deviant ideas, and even spying for the United Kingdom. He was tried without cameras, convicted, and shot in December. To prevent anyone from accumulating that level of power again, the ministry was divided into two. This is how the KGB was born, with separate functions. Beria disappeared from records. His name was never officially mentioned again. Malenkov took charge of the Council of Ministers. In Stalin's time, he had handled technical matters, participated in purges, and spoken on behalf of the party when the leader was no longer present. Now he held the highest government position. He was also secretary of the Central Committee for a few months, but he left that post, which allowed Khrushchev to take that control from the party. Malenkov tried to change some things. He presented plans with less defense spending, more resources for agriculture, tax reductions, and the production of useful goods for the population. But no one was ready for that shift. The majority remained anchored in the old logic. Khrushchev, for his part, focused on a project to cultivate virgin lands in Kazakhstan. This garnered him support and strengthened his position within the apparatus. In 1954, Malenkov's position began to fall. A year later, he was forced out. Bulganin, who was on Khrushchev's side, took his place. Malenkov became a figurehead with no room for maneuver. In 1957, he tried to get back in the game. Along with Molotov and Kaganovich, he tried to oust Khrushchev. They failed. The Central Committee defended Khrushchev and expelled all three of them. Malenkov was sent to a power plant in Kazakhstan. He never held an important position again. His time in power was short with different ideas, but without the structure to carry them out. Molotov, on the other hand, had always been there. He signed the pact with Germany, was chancellor during the war, and remained in politics afterward. At the beginning of the post-war period, he had influence, negotiated in Europe, and established positions. Over time, he became isolated. He opposed reforms, defended the system Stalin had built, and didn't fit in with the new plans. At the party congress in 1956, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's abuses. Molotov tried to stop that. He proposed that the speech be about Stalin as Lenin's heir, but he had no support. Afterward, he joined Malenkov and Kaganovich to try to displace Khrushchev. He also failed. They removed him from the presidium, gave him a symbolic position in Mongolia, and erased him from decisions. He no longer signed anything important. He did not write, give interviews, or publish a line. He died in 1986 in Moscow without official rehabilitation. He ended his life as a shadow, watched, set aside, but never purged. Since Beria was eliminated, those who remained in the circle began to move more carefully. Malenkov remained at the head of the government for a time, but the one gaining ground was Khrushchev, who had a base in the party and showed no signs of stopping. He took advantage of the fact that no one wanted another single leader as strong as Stalin and began to forge alliances. First, he took control of the regional cadres. Then he organized the campaign to work the virgin lands in Central Asia, which gave him support in the lower structures. His figure began to grow from there without direct confrontations, but advancing steadily. In 1956, he used the party congress to deliver the main blow. In a closed-door speech, he described the arrests, tortures, and crimes committed during Stalin's government. He did not mention the names of his accomplices, but he made it clear that the path had to change. No one expected anything like that. In the corridors of the Congress, many leaders did not know how to react. Inside the country, the apparatus tried to maintain silence, but the news leaked. Outside, in Eastern Europe, protest movements began to appear. In Poland, leaders negotiated adjustments without breaking with Moscow. In Hungary, the uprising was total. A new government was formed. They announced their withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, and Soviet tanks entered by force. The operation left thousands dead. After that, the message was clear. Mistakes could be discussed, but the system would not be dismantled. Khrushchev did not abandon power after that crisis. On the contrary, he consolidated his position. He began to reorganize the ministries, divided the areas by economic regions, removed competencies from Moscow, and handed over functions to new local councils. The idea was to reduce bureaucracy, but it generated confusion. Many did not know who to answer to. Some officials were displaced without understanding the reasons. At the same time, the creation of sovkhozes, state farms that concentrated resources, was promoted. The kolkhozes continued to function, but increasingly controlled from above. Peasant families were also allowed to have a small private plot of land, which improved production somewhat, but did not solve the general supply problem. In the cities, the focus shifted to consumption. Millions of apartments were built, the supply of basic products increased. Stores filled with radios, clocks, and refrigerators. They weren't of good quality, but they were available. An international fair was organized in Moscow where Soviet advancements were showcased. At the same event, Khrushchev debated face-to-face with Nixon, the Vice President of the United States, in front of cameras. He showed confidence, even arrogance. He wanted to be seen as modern, different, someone who could talk to the West without backing down. Externally, he sought a more stable relationship with Washington. He met with Eisenhower in Geneva. Then he visited the United States. He walked through New York, spoke at the United Nations, and toured factories. It seemed like a tour designed to show closeness. But all that fell apart with the Berlin crisis. The city remained divided. Many crossed from east to west. To stop this, in 1961, the GDR authorities, with Soviet backing, erected a wall. No one could pass. The order was executed overnight. Soldiers surrounded the area, put up fences and laid concrete. The city was split in two. Western powers protested but did not intervene. The wall remained. That same year, Khrushchev announced that communism would be achieved in 20 years. He presented ambitious plans. He promised to surpass capitalism. He spoke of record harvests, technological advancements, and mass housing. Ideologically, he reinforced his image. His face appeared in all media. Stalin's body was removed from the mausoleum. The old leader's image was erased. Books, monuments, and street names were changed. The line was to look forward, not backward. But Khrushchev's management began to show cracks. Economically, the plans were contradictory. On one hand, heavy industry was prioritized. On the other, more focus was requested on consumption. Administrative reforms weren't working well. Many local leaders accumulated positions without knowing what to do with them. In agriculture, the virgin lands began to yield less. The soil was depleting. More inputs, more transport, more machinery were needed. The system couldn't keep up. In foreign policy, the point of greatest tension came in 1962. Cuba had aligned with Moscow and accepted the installation of nuclear missiles in its territory. American satellites detected the bases under construction. Kennedy demanded their removal. A naval blockade was imposed. For days, the two countries were on the verge of direct conflict. Finally, Khrushchev ordered the missiles removed. He did not consult the Presidium. He didn't explain anything to the party. He made the decision alone. Although he avoided a war, many in the leadership saw it as a mistake. They thought he had conceded too quickly. His internal authority was weakened. After that, his position began to decline. He tried to maintain control with more reforms. He proposed separating the party leadership into agricultural and industrial sectors. He changed the structure of regional committees. He increased pressure on the republics to meet targets. But resistance grew. Some said he intervened in everything without knowing the subjects. Others accused him of improvising. Internal discipline became disordered. In 1964, a group of leaders organized his removal. Among them were Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny. They took advantage of his absence on vacation. They convened a meeting in the Central Committee and informed him of the decision. Khrushchev did not resist. He accepted. He said he was old, that he lacked energy. They removed him without scandal. They gave him a house in Moscow. He never again appeared at official events. He was not judged nor persecuted. He lived in retirement. He wrote some memoirs which were published abroad. He died in 1971. With him ended the era of voluntaristic change. The one who replaced him was Brezhnev, someone who knew the apparatus and had no intention of moving things around much. Brezhnev took office with the idea of stabilizing everything. He wanted no surprises or conflicts. From day one, he made it clear that his priority was order. He reunified structures that Khrushchev had separated, restored classic ministries, and reversed regional changes. Where there had once been dispersed councils, he re-established central offices. The priority was for every part of the state to know its function, for nothing to go off script. He surrounded himself with people he had known for a long time, especially from the group that had come with him from Dnepropetrovsk. They were loyal cadres, with no visible personal aspirations, loyal to the established system they already knew. The economy maintained the same planning scheme. A limited reform was authorized in 1965 to reorganize incentives, but it remained superficial. Goals continued to come down from Moscow, as did resources. Some companies were allowed to keep part of their profits, but most continued to respond to imposed quotas. During the first years, industrial production rose, as did agriculture. This served to show results. Housing was built, salaries were increased, and services were expanded. People had access to televisions, refrigerators, and cars, although with long waiting lists. The basics were covered, but there was no real improvement in efficiency. After the 70s, everything slowed down. Productivity decreased each year, the apparatus expanded uncontrollably, and decisions were made out of habit. Technological innovations arrived late or were poorly copied. Factories used old machines, transportation was deficient, and the countryside needed gigantic subsidies to maintain itself. Despite this, the country continued to import grain, especially from the United States. Oil and gas prices rose, and that saved the economy from immediate collapse. Thanks to this influx of foreign currency, the system was sustained for another decade without almost any modifications. Foreign policy aimed to project strength. Agreements were signed with Nixon and Carter to limit nuclear armaments. Brezhnev traveled to Washington, received Western presidents in Moscow, and gave conciliatory speeches. But at the same time, guerrillas, communist parties, and allied regimes in Asia, Africa, and Latin America were supported. The official line was to maintain influence on all possible fronts. In 1979, the decision was made to intervene in Afghanistan. The local communist government requested support. Moscow sent troops. The entry was swift. They took Kabul, installed a new leader, and secured key buildings. What followed was a long war, with daily clashes and thousands of casualties. The USSR got stuck in a conflict that wouldn't end, with soldiers dying and no clear way out. Internally, a certain cultural openness was permitted, but always with defined limits. Books previously banned could be published, as long as they didn't question the system. Authors like Solzhenitsyn were watched, censored, or directly expelled. Sakharov was removed from public life. Samizdat appeared, an informal network of copies of prohibited texts. They circulated in secret. Surveillance remained active, though more selective. The KGB observed everything. If someone stood out with uncomfortable ideas, they received warnings or ended up isolated. There were no mass trials like in the 1930s, but control remained firm. With the passage of time, the government became filled with older people. The average age of the Politburo exceeded 70 years. There was very little rotation. Decisions were made by a closed group, where the priority was to avoid sudden movements. No one proposed reforms, no one asked for changes. Everything remained the same. The motto was to avoid errors, not to innovate. Many officials reached their positions through loyalty, not ability. Nepotism was tolerated, and the families of leaders were allowed to accumulate privileges. Corruption increased, but the topic was not discussed. It was part of the system. Brezhnev accumulated honors, medals, and titles. He received decorations for every anniversary. His image was shown as a symbol of stability, but in the last years of his life, his health deteriorated. He had respiratory and cardiovascular problems and needed constant medication. He barely appeared in public. When he did, he was helped to walk, speak, and sign documents. The group around him began to make decisions for him. Ustinov in defense, Gromyko in foreign affairs, Andropov in the KGB, Chernenko in the party secretariat. It was a de facto leadership, without an active figure. Each managed their area, with agreements among themselves to maintain continuity. Between 1980 and 1982, Brezhnev hardly participated in anything. Meetings were brief and reports were filtered before reaching him. His inner circle prevented any information about his real condition from leaking out. At the same time, discontent at the grassroots level grew. Product shortages increased. The black market expanded. People found solutions outside official channels. Many knew something was wrong, but no one had the power to initiate a different direction. In the streets, life went on, but with clear signs of exhaustion. He died on November 10, 1982. A formal funeral was organized. He was buried in Red Square in a marshal's uniform. There was no mass mourning. The media repeated the usual: achievements, firmness, continuity. But behind closed doors, they already knew that changes had to be made. The next in line was Yuri Andropov, who came from the KGB. He had managed the security services for more than a decade. He knew the apparatus from the inside. He had reports on everyone. He knew who had stolen, who had lied, who had failed. During Brezhnev's illness, he had been accumulating strength, and when the time came, he faced no obstacles in taking the lead. When Chernenko could no longer sustain himself, they began to cover his position without saying so. He spent entire days without speaking, with doctors coming in and out of his house. Decisions continued to come from the committee, but everyone knew they weren't his. The last time he was seen in public, he could barely stand. In March of 1985, his death was announced. The ceremony was brief, without long speeches or heartfelt tributes. Right there, the next day, Gorbachev was chosen. There was no dispute. He was young, came with strength, and those who remained understood that they had no way to stop him. At that time he was 54 years old and had already passed through the entire apparatus, from the countryside to the Politburo. He had grown up in the south, in a rural village, within a family of collective farmers. From a young age, he worked in the fields, then studied law in Moscow and returned as an organizer in the Komsomol. He climbed the ranks of the regional party until he reached the main offices. When Brezhnev was still in charge, he was already in the Central Committee. In 1980, he was put into the Politburo. After 2 funerals in a row in less than 3 years, his arrival marked something different. The first thing he did was change the older officials. He sent many to retirement, brought in new faces, and began to move pieces. He started with a campaign against corruption, reviewed reports, removed several from state-owned enterprises, and forced others to account for their actions. But after a few months, he realized that wasn't enough. The economy wasn't reacting. Productivity was stagnant, factories were inefficient, and everything depended on decisions that came from above. It was then that he began to speak of perestroika, which meant reorganizing everything from the base to the leadership. Shortly after, he added another word, glasnost, which opened the door to talk about what was previously untouched. Newspapers began publishing previously forbidden content. Universities started debating openly. Artists, writers, and researchers all began to stir. Restrictions eased. Some topics were still sensitive, but the margin was much wider than before. Even so, he continued to defend the party as the central structure. He didn't want to dismantle it. He bet he could reform it without breaking it. He approved laws authorizing small private businesses, cooperatives, and greater autonomy for factories. He promoted internal elections with multiple candidates. This hadn't been seen since the early years of the revolution. The lists were no longer single choice. In some cities, voters began choosing between 2 or 3 options. Those from the old system began to resist. They said nothing in public, but discomfort was evident within the Central Committee. Some quietly distanced themselves. He kept pushing. He supported the return of dissidents like Sakharov, allowed previously clandestine publications, and placed his people in key positions. In 1988, he was already president of the Supreme Soviet. He controlled decisions and used that leverage to advance more quickly. He reduced the military presence abroad, withdrew troops from Afghanistan, and said that each country in the bloc could decide its own path. It was the end of the intervention doctrine. Without saying so, he was letting Eastern Europe go. That same year, changes began in Poland, then came Hungary. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Communist governments began to fall one after another. Moscow did not intervene. He did not give the order to act. He let them go. This position was well received abroad. He was rewarded, invited to conferences, and presented as a symbol of change. But inside the country, things were different. Inflation skyrocketed, products were scarce, and queues grew longer. The republics wanted more autonomy. Some were already talking about independence. In Lithuania, they made a formal declaration. In others, protests grew. He tried to maintain the union with a new federal pact, but there was less and less support. In parallel, Boris Yeltsin gained ground. Yeltsin left the party, presented himself as leader of the Russian parliament, and began to confront him directly. While Gorbachev spoke of gradual reforms, Yeltsin made more radical decisions. In 1991, a group of conservative officials tried to stage a coup. They isolated Gorbachev in his residence, cut communications, and sent tanks into the streets. Yeltsin climbed onto a tank in front of the parliament and took control. The attempt failed in a few days. After that, the party was suspended. The republics began to separate. In December of 1991, Gorbachev resigned. On the 25th, he handed over his office. The next day, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. There were no more red flags, no central committees, no Soviets. What remained was the Russian Federation, with Yeltsin in command. In the former republics, some of the old leaders adapted. Others disappeared from the map. Some formed new parties. Others went into business. In several countries, there were elections. In others, the same old leaders changed their uniforms. Meanwhile, Gorbachev was left without a position, without a party, and without influence. He lived in his apartment, rarely went out, and began to write. He published books, gave interviews, and traveled abroad. In Russia, he was criticized. They said he had ruined the country. Outside he was applauded. The apparatus he had tried to transform no longer existed. Secret documents began to come to light. Archives, recordings, and surveillance lists appeared. It became known how decisions worked, who authorized, who signed, who made whom disappear. In the cities, statues were taken down. Some streets changed names. In others, they remained as they were. History became uncomfortable. In Moscow, the past became a market. Books, films, exhibitions, everything was a product. No one was held accountable. There were no trials or commissions, just a disorganized review without those responsible. Some former leaders died without saying anything. Others gave brief interviews. None apologized. Those who had been in charge could no longer respond. The generation of power was fading without a sound. In Eastern Europe, the process was different. In some countries, there were convictions, pensions were withdrawn, and school books were changed. In the Baltic states, memory laws were promoted. In Russia, no. The chaos of the 90s left no time for that. People had other priorities. The economy was sinking, services were collapsing, and internal wars were breaking out. No one dealt with the past. The names of the former leaders remained as blurred references in unhighlighted manuals. They no longer commanded. They no longer mattered.